Hi everyone, welcome to the first episode of Bones and Stones for 2021. Welcome to a new year, hopefully a year filled with a lot more good things than the previous year. I think it seems like 2021's got a lot more hope to it than last year had, so let's hope that sort of comes through. But yeah, welcome to the first episode of the year, and today we're going to chat just between the three of us about the earlier Stone Age. And part of the reason why is while I was traveling around at the end of last year, I drove through an area called I drove in the Sundays River Valley near Kirkwood. And it's a really, really beautiful part of South Africa. Had never been there before. And it's amazing. It's incredibly lush. It's very vibrant. There's a lot going on there. It's a really lovely valley. And I remember that obviously Matt Lotter had done his PhD there and excavated a number of sites, and he's written a bunch of papers now. And as I drove through this region, obviously I started thinking about this really boring ESA period. Nearly crashed a few times, fell asleep once. But, you know, by and large, the thought process was, I suppose it was entertaining. No, I mean, obviously it's a really cool area, but while I was driving through, you know, jokes aside, obviously it's a really nice area. And I started wondering why this was a sort of special landscape from an earlier Stone Age point of view. And that's, Matt, what I'd like to sort of ask you first, you know, like why the Sundays, or what is special about that part of South Africa that lends towards earlier Stone Age research?
Fair enough. It's awesome that you got to go there. It really is a beautiful landscape. So before I maybe get into the broader significance, let me maybe paint the pretty scene that is the Sundays River Valley. So if you just think about lovely rolling hills of Addo, kind of pristine bushveld. Keep in mind the Addo Elephant National Park is just bordering the Sundays River Valley. So, you know, kind of just think of a wonderful national park. You've got wild animals kind of running around. In between that, you've got small little towns. And dotted in between all of that, you've got a massive concentration of citrus farms. It's a large citrus producing area in South Africa. And then you have all of these kind of undulating hills. And around Kirkwood, you've got this amazing rock formation called the Kirkwood Cretaceous Formation, where there's this kind of a massive vertical profile with all these different clays and silts of different colors. So I hope I'm painting a pretty beautiful scene here. And then at the end of the valley, you've got a small town called Colchester, and then that enters, that's where the Sundays River, enters the Indian Ocean. So it's this really awesome area where you've got pristine bushland, you've got these agricultural farmlands with the citrus establishments, and then you've got the coast just nearby as well. So, you know, when I was looking to get involved in an area for my research, you know, the aesthetic appeal and the fact that it was very close to the coast really excited me. You know, the fact that you could be in the bush, seeing animals, doing our excavation work, working hard during the day, and then, you know, we would then have some time to go to the coast on the weekend as well, which is quite nice. Now, just getting back to the actual significance of the area from a Stone Age point of view, you know, we've known for a very long time that the earlier Stone Age record within the Eastern Cape is there, okay? But it really came down to the fact that not many people had done a lot of research in the region, and this was the case up until quite recently. And Cara Macrawana would be able to attest to this as well. But at least in the Sundays River, there was a researcher by the name of Ruddock. I actually don't know his first name, unfortunately, but he in the 50s did some work with Clarence van Rietlo, and he was assisted by the Abbe Braille. And they essentially went around the Kruger River valleys and the Sundays River valleys, looking at road cuttings and some old river terraces that, you know, kind of occur adjacent to the present Sundays River. And they found a whole pile of surface archaeological artifacts throughout the region. And the one thing that they noted, obviously, was the sheer abundance. And they compared the material to stuff that looked, or at least it looked very similar to the material from the Vaal River Basin, which also at the time was being explored, I think, from the 20s and 30s. And that played a pivotal role in kind of the formation of the Stone Ages of South Africa. So that's where it all started. So in the 50s, the initial exploration in amongst the fluvial terraces of the region, and that's where this abundance of artifacts was discovered. But then nothing happened. Nothing happened for several decades until those initial kind of papers came out in the 50s explaining that there was archaeology there. And then what happened, there was a master's student who was working with Professor Darrell Granger based at Purdue University. And she was looking at the kind of the evolution of the Southern African subcontinent from a geomorphological perspective. in terms of how a certain landscape's developed. And the Sundays River seemed like a very key area because there'd been a series of terraces that had been located within the valley. So we have this series of alluvial terraces, which occurs adjacent to the river, and then we had these artifacts. So Erika Erlanger, Professor Del Granger, Dr. Ryan Gibbon went to the Sundays River to perform cosmogenic nuclide dating on several of the fluvial terraces within the valley. And most importantly, other than the fact, obviously, that they were able to get ages and then were able to establish a chronology for those terraces, the main thing is that they were able to confirm that the Stone Age artifacts were occurring in situ within the fluvial deposits. Whereas in the 50s, Ruddock had reported that these artifacts were just scattered on the surface. So obviously that, kind of pricked up our ears a bit. And that's really kind of where it all started in terms of how we then began to, start appreciating the significance of the region from an earlier Stone Age perspective, the fact that we could find these Stone Age artifacts within the terraces.
So Matt, that's in the 50s, you say sort of research sort of petered out there. Is that because they didn't have a good understanding of the context of the artifacts, or is it because at that early stage, understanding of stone tool and in that case, earlier Stone Age assemblages was not developed enough to realize the importance of the finds in this area?
To be honest, I actually don't know. And I'm going to bring Kara in on this as well, because, later on in the 60s and 70s, that's when Amanzi Springs comes to the fore. And Hilary Deacon began the excavations at Amanzi Springs, and that's where things kind of proliferate there. So, yeah, I'm not sure why the Sundays River was ignored for such a long time. But Kara, let me maybe hand over to you in terms of talking about Amanzi.
Yeah, thanks, fellas. And it's a really interesting perspective that you've brought up on the Sundays River Valley there, Matt. So thanks for that. And yeah, there are these sort of critical times in the Eastern Cape, critical periods where the ESA is taken very seriously and explored very well. And it's mainly just based around the fact that you have these sites that are discovered or that they're reinvestigated, which is the case with Amanzi Springs in the 1960s. The archaeological occurrence from that particular site, and this is very close to where the Sundays River Valley is, just in the next river valley, which is the Kucha River Valley. Well, it's been known to be an archaeological deposit since the 1800s, actually. And the author first, Percy Fitzpatrick, who wrote Jock of the Bushveld, he actually owned that piece of property, and when it was sort of like the original citrus farm in that area. Then in the 1960s, Ray Inskeep, who was based at Cape Town University then as a professor in archaeology, was brought to that site through an just like a sort of informal archaeological society, and he did some very preliminary excavations there. At the time, he had a master's student who was Hilary Deacon, and Hilary took that project up as a portion of his master's work. And then the site lay fallow until we returned in 2015. And I think actually the sort of reason why sites are sort of focused on and then lay fallow for so long is just due to interest, time, and manpower. So Hilary Deacon eventually took up a post at the Albany Museum there, but at that point in time, he was dealing with Classy's River. He was dealing with Howisson's Port rock shelter. He left Amanzi Springs altogether. Point is that he started excavating all over South Africa. And so there were more sites than he was able to handle. And I think his investigations into the Middle Stone Age and even later Stone Age, which his wife is very well known for, that those took priority for them. And so it just came down to the fact that there was not a lot of people who were interested in actually going out and re-investigating these sites, which is, a good thing for myself and guys like Matt Lauder, because in the modern age, we're able to take modern technology, record sites in much more detail. And so essentially it's a bit of a benefit to have these sites sort of not investigated for so long, because we're able to capture so much more information in these sort of modern times.
So, and then just, I mean, with both of your sites, in terms of chronology, like what kinds of periods are we looking at each of them, just so that people sort of know exactly what periods of industry we're talking about?
Yeah, so in the Eastern Cape specifically, with the earlier Stone Age, we're talking about the Acheulean period. And interestingly enough, there are a lot of sites that we would sort of assign to a later phase of the Acheulean. We're not talking about Forest Smith or the so-called transitional periods, but we're looking at a time period of about less than 600,000 years for many of the sites. So I'm thinking of Cape Henklip, I'm thinking of Heelhoutboom, and I'm thinking of Amanzi Springs, which have all been typologically assigned to the sort of later Acheulean period. However, at Sundays River, that necessarily may not be the case. So, Matt, if you want to maybe just talk about the chronology of Pen Hill Farm quickly, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt. I think just to zoom out a little bit again, talking about the terraces and the actual valley. So when the dating study was conducted by Erika Erlanger and colleagues back in 2012, they dated a few of the terraces. There's actually 13 different terraces based on our kind of current understandings of the regional fluvial geomorphology in terms of the structure of the terraces. And they were able to get a date of several of the different terraces. And I think the oldest date, I may be wrong here, I'm just trying to think back to the 2012 paper, but I think some of the older higher terraces go back 4 or 5 million years, which is quite incredible. Then when we start looking at the terraces where we find the archaeological material, specifically around terrace 9 and 10, that's where the sites start coming in at around 1.1 million. And then we have younger terraces like Terrace 10, which comes in at around 650,000. So that's the kind of period that we're dealing with. But another thing that I just wanted to mention as well is there is a lot of archaeological material throughout the entire Sundays River Valley. And this is something that, you know, when I went there in 2011, and I went there with Professor Dominic Stratford from Wits University, when we did our first survey, our first kind of initial trip to the area to look at the feasibility of putting together the PhD research and the project, we were just completely taken aback by the fact that there was clearly an earlier Stone Age signature across the landscape and within the fluvial terraces, but as well as Middle Stone Age and later Stone Age as well, which is pretty interesting, which nobody had ever reported. This was just based on obviously preliminary observations during the survey, but the Middle Stone Age component is definitely there. And some of the dates that Erlanger and colleagues got on some of the younger terraces kind of tie in with the earlier Middle Stone Age, which is quite interesting. So there is that possible aspect that can be explored as well. So at Pen Hill, just to come back to your question, Matt, Pen Hill, we are currently kind of resolving the dating issues there. The original date that was put forward by Erlanger and colleagues comes in at around 1.34, and that dates the deposition for the terrace. And obviously we have the archaeological material which was deposited on top of that terrace, so that would be a maximum age for that site. But generally, looking at other Terrace 9 sites like Burnhill Farm, which we wrote up and described in the bulletin back in 2018, that sits at around 1.1. So we're kind of in and around that mark, at least.
So that's pretty old stuff, man. And then, so this Acheulean, these Acheulean assemblages that you're picking up in these areas and across other parts of the Eastern Cape, how does it relate to other parts of South Africa where people have been studying Acheulean assemblages? Are you finding a lot of similarities in terms of the morphology of the tools, production technologies and techniques, or is it different?
It's a very interesting question, Tim, and it's a question that I think has been largely ignored in Acheulean research in general, and this is the question of regionality. When we look at Middle Stone Age research, we see a lot of focus on various regions around Africa, and let's say within Southern Africa, there being a lot of comparisons between different parts of this specific country. We don't, unfortunately, find that type of focus in the Acheulean. A lot of studies seem to sort of document very similar patterns across Acheulean sites, no matter where you are. whether you're looking in China or in the very southern part of Africa. And so we don't get a lot of understanding about regionality and, how things like different raw material sourcing behaviors, different types of behaviors that might relate to subsistence activities affect tool types and their shaping and so on and so forth. People often see a lot of homogeneity, but this is a question that really needs to be explored. And I think a large part of it comes from the fact that Acheulean assemblages tend to focus on what are called large cutting tools, your hand axes and your cleavers. And so the production methods might be very similar. However, focusing in a little bit more finer resolution on things like core reduction strategies, flake shapes and types might help to speak to regional patterns of production. So this is actually the topic of a young PhD student that I'm supervising now, who's comparing some of the interior sites along the Vaal River and the coastal sites along South Africa that are currently assigned or known to be assigned to the late Acheulean. So I really hope that we do have some resolution on this matter, in the next coming years. But my sort of gut instinct is to say that because of sort of radically different environments, it would stand to make sense that there should be some differences depending upon what region we're looking on. Unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of research that speaks to that at this point in time.
Well, carrying on from, sorry, Matt, you want to add in?
Yeah, sorry, no, just to add something in there. I think Matt hit the nail on the head there with regards to kind of the direction of research moving forward. I know there's a few other students as well looking at this regionality aspect. As Matt said, comparing interior sites to coastal sites, not only in South Africa, but in Southern Africa more generally. And I think it's important to just zoom out on the landscapes and factor in all of the different data sets that we can bring into these studies, looking at differences in the environment, looking at ecological variables and stuff. And Amanzi is obviously a very good site in that respect. Matt, you haven't mentioned this yet, but because of the incredible preservation of organics. And that's one of the reasons why Amanzi is the most well-known earlier Stone Age site for the Eastern Cape, is the fact that you have this incredible preservation.
So, extending from that and talking about this as kind of like a research theme that people are starting to think more and more about, and their students involved and so on. What other aspects of the Acheulean do you think are sort of critical in terms of where research should be headed?
Yeah, good, Matt. Go ahead.
I think it's always good to look at work that's being done elsewhere. For example, if you look at East Africa, Olduvai Gorge, some incredible work that's being done there. I think the main thing is to incorporate landscape archaeology as much as possible, where we zoom out of the landscape and use data sets that operate at a range of different scales in order to, kind of understand sites more holistically. I think too often in the past, there's been this kind of focus on individual artifacts and treating sites as individual entities within landscapes. But in reality, these sites would have, operated within a much broader environmental and ecological system. And I think it's important to capture that information. And that's why it's so necessary to zoom out now and look at the broader landscape using these different data sets. At least that's my take on it. And I know that's also coming from a geoarchaeological background where, you used to, kind of zooming in, looking at individual sediment grains within a deposit, and then zooming out and looking at an entire deposit, and then looking at the side of a mountain and working out how it got there. So that's just to kind of, put things into context there. Matt, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think to complement what you've said, Matt, it's an incredibly important thing to zoom out and look at where these sites are situated on the landscape. So, for instance, Amanzi Springs was sort of thought to be a potential workshop site. Gonan Sharon did his PhD thesis, and based upon some metrics of hand axes and cleavers, thought that these tools could represent in some way, shape, or form roughouts that were rejected and left behind because they're incredibly thick and they're incredibly large in their mass. And in any case, if that is the scenario, which is something we're currently testing while we're working there, I think Amanzi Springs would represent then a really interesting sort of locale on this greater Eastern Cape landscape because of the spring sites. The water there would have been, let's say, 30 to 40 degrees Celsius, so it would have been quite warm. It hosts a very unique ecological environment in terms of the plants growing there, in terms of the sort of game that would have been coming there. And there are lots of boulders and cobbles that are situated on the hill because of erosion and deflation of a geological unit called the Enon Formation, which then hosted a conglomerate that was largely comprised of quartzitic boulders and cobbles. And so you have this particular area that has a very unique ecological situation, but is also a sort of area where raw materials could be easily collected. And so there, if this was a workshop locality, what it speaks to me is that the Acheulean populations really understood the landscape. They really understood that there were these certain resources in certain areas, and to try to tie in activities such as tool making and tool use maybe will provide a better insight into this sort of understanding of how they were sort of parsing up the landscape. So they looked at Amanzi Springs and thought, we can return to this place because we have X, X, and X types of resources. Then we can travel over to the Sundays River. Their tool production may vary, quite a bit, maybe not so much. We're investigating that. But if it did vary quite a bit, if we did see variability, it might suggest that they were then tailoring their behavioral habits in terms of making tools to what local resources were available. And so for me, I think this is actually a really interesting insight into the cognitive life of Acheulean hominids, particularly in the sort of middle to late period. And that maybe the areas that we find sites based in are not just because of, the raw material sources are sitting right on your doorstep, but maybe that there are greater ecological advantages that these populations were sort of taking advantage of. And that's, I think, going to require more insight into tool use. So useware studies is sort of on my mind as a sort of particular hotspot, but then also better resolution on paleo environments is needed to understand what types of sort of environmental surrounds or environs these late Acheulean sites were placed would be very key to understanding the sort of ecological significance of these sites as well as their assemblages.
Now it's interesting. John Parkington, he wrote a paper in 1980 called "Time and Place," which was about opportunities that are present and available around a site or a place, and those are shifting and changing and dependent on a number of conditions. And through these assemblages and the construction of these assemblages, often can relate to the opportunities that are available to the people living at the site, because you're doing X, Y, and Z, so you need this set of tools for that purpose. But would you imagine you can get that kind of resolution? Because when you're looking at paleoclimatic records and you're looking at what environmental opportunities and ecological opportunities are available in terms of what plants that could be exploiting in environment, paleoclimatic studies, do they really give you that kind of resolution to be able to sort of really closely predict those kinds of activities? I mean, obviously with useware, you can kind of back that up, but when you're talking about something that's 500,000 years ago to 1 million or more years ago, there's so much that you've lost in terms of the archaeological data you can rely on in order to address those kinds of issues.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Tim. And you're absolutely right. It really does depend upon the quality of what types of proxies you're able to recover from sites. So I mean, again, as Matt had sort of suggested, at Amanzi Springs, we have very good organic preservation. So all of a sudden we have, the potential of pollen, phytolith, and wood resources that will help us, really sort of create a nice high resolution record throughout time once our dating results are finalized and published. At other sites, it's probably not going to be the case. So I'm thinking of probably Sundays River is not the best place for this. But recently there was a researcher, Michaela Ecker, who looked at Wonderwerk Cave, particularly within the sort of stratums that are that are in the sort of Oldowan and I think early Acheulean sort of time period, and they were able to start talking about paleo environments. And one of the things that I have not seen sort of well introduced into the excavation of Acheulean sites is many attempts to try to see what can be sort of used as a proxy for paleoenvironmental reconstructions. I mean, anything would help us start to build a picture. However, as you say, there are a lot of challenges, and it's not as easy as just going and bagging some sediment and looking for pollen or phytoliths or something like this. There's a lot of conditions that have to be satisfied in terms of preservation first.
Okay. Yeah, well, thanks for the chat, guys. It's really interesting to hear about, the Acheulean and all this kind of. I mean, we always joke about our different stone tool industries, and but they are all really fascinating periods of time. And yeah, thanks for introducing me as well as the listeners to this really cool part of South Africa and our history. Just to wrap up, last sort of question, especially for the sort of younger viewers, the undergraduates who are watching these videos. What do you think is the most intriguing thing about the Acheulean that can draw in younger students to come and start studying in this period of time? I'm putting you on the spot here, I get it.
So for me, I think it's the idea that we're talking about periods where we're looking at populations and we don't really understand the dynamics between different population groups. We can only assume that sort of knowledge was shared within very small sort of family groups or maybe bands of people, sort of several families living together, that type of thing. And yet we have this picture that the way that certain tools were shaped, like hand axes and cleavers, has spread from Africa all the way throughout different parts of the world. And we're talking about a time period here that, is around 1 million years in its length. So for me, it's a really interesting question to start thinking about how actually complex these, sort of small populations were in terms of how they were communicating with each other, how they were passing upon knowledge. So we don't find a lot of differences in throughout any sort of time period within the Acheulean, whether it be an early, middle, or later period, or an early and late period, in terms of the way that these tools were made. And so it does suggest that there was some sense of high fidelity, of knowledge transmission, of learning that took place. And when we think about the sort of time span these tools were made and used and their consistency, I think it does actually suggest that these are very complex individuals living within potentially complex societal groups. And that, maybe there was sort of cross forms of communication. However, it's all speculative. What we need is better technology, higher resolution, and young minds who are interested in these subjects to try to find ways to suggest these types of, or sort of investigate these types of ways of Acheulean, people were living on the landscape, how they were communicating, how they were teaching, how they were learning. And so for me, I think it's an incredible challenge that then takes a lot of innovation to think about, because we don't have a lot of great evidence. We only have this sort of stone tool record, a minimal fossil record in terms of paleoanthropology. And so it takes, a lot of passion and a lot of vigor to really sit down and try to grapple with these problems. But I think it's a really wonderful problem to have. Yeah. And for me, I think that's the most exciting thing, is maybe potentially one day stumbling upon some way of looking at those sort of intergroup relationships.
Yeah.
If I could maybe just jump in there with a different perspective, obviously echoing everything that you've said, Matt, as well. Absolutely. For me, it's, understanding what's going on pre-modern Homo sapiens. It's really important, and how we are able to investigate the earliest forms of technology, and then how we developed as a species and how we adapted our technologies through time. That's always what's interested me. But maybe to capture the students from a different perspective, in terms of how I got interested in Acheulean archaeology, was getting the chance to do fieldwork. spending time in the field with world-renowned academics and researchers at or from academic institutions, going into the field with my lecturers and fellow friends and colleagues, and seeing the country, going to different parts of the country that I would never have been to myself. That's the thing. We get to work in often very remote locations, experience incredible landscapes filled with amazing ecological and environmental diversity. And I think for me, that was something that captured my interest very early on. Another aspect is that you could do lab-based research as well. So it's not always about getting into the field when it comes to Ashleyan research. There's a lot of lab-based work you can do as well. So you don't see yourself as, the Indiana Jones running around wrangling animals and doing all sorts of funny stuff. That's fine. There's aspects of this kind of research that you can still get involved with. Working with the Ashleyan is a challenging environment, as Matt has said. Often we are dealing with very kind of scant, sparse evidence of the past. We're dealing with great time depth. So it's obviously very difficult. And we approach our study materials in a very unique and specific way. Well, I think all Stone Age researchers do, but it's especially challenging in the earlier Ashleyan, or the Ashleyan in general, where we're dealing with such little evidence. So I think if you're the kind of student who is interested in exploring the country, seeing the country, learning new skills, working with different people, then I think it's definitely something that you should consider getting involved in.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Thanks for the chat. That was really cool. And to all the viewers, again, thanks for watching. And it's obviously our first episode of the year. We've got a few new plans and tricks up our sleeves that will slowly unfold as time goes by, but we appreciate it. And to you guys, thanks again. That was really cool. And we'll see everyone soon.